This video is brought to you by Nebula. When we did our last Ukraine update a couple of weeks ago, we suggested that the Ukrainians in Bakhmut were about to be encircled by the Russians. At the time, the Ukrainians were relying on just one supply route in and out of Bakhmut, and Wagner were making slow but steady progress from the suburbs towards the centre of the city. However, in the past week or so, the Russian advance has stalled, and there's been an emerging consensus that the Russian offensive in Bakhmut is running out of steam. So, in this video, we're going to take another look at Bakhmut, why the Russian advance has stalled, hint it's probably about the divide between Wagner and the rest of the Russian MOD, and ask whether Zelensky was actually right to keep troops in Bakhmut, against the advice of US intelligence and the armchair generals on Twitter. So let's start with a bit of context. After the Russians took the towns of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in July of last year, they started moving west towards the few remaining Ukrainian holdouts in Donbass, most notably Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, each with a pre-war population of about 100,000. The Kremlin had made it clear that they considered the capture of Donbass a strategic priority, largely because Putin had recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and they committed a significant number of troops to the effort, including tens of thousands of Wagner mercenaries. Having ceded Lysychansk, Ukrainian forces regrouped in Bakhmut, a smaller town that lies about 30 kilometers east of Kramatorsk, presumably because they realized that the Russians would be unable to take either Sloviansk or Kramatorsk without taking Bakhmut first. All major roads in the area run through Bakhmut, so unless the Russians want to trek through a load of muddy fields, they were always going to have to take Bakhmut before Sloviansk or Kramatorsk. Given the number of troops involved, the Russians probably expected to take Bakhmut relatively quickly, but this isn't quite how it panned out, and for nearly 6 months, the front line barely moved. In order to overwhelm the Ukrainians, Wagner sent more and more troops into the town, including conscripts in human wave attacks. In response, the Ukrainians sent more troops into the town themselves, and the casualty rate in the town quickly earned it the nickname the meat grinder. Eventually, though, Wagner's strategy paid dividends. Beginning in January, Wagner successfully began encircling Bakhmut, steadily cutting off Ukraine's supply routes and isolating the Ukrainian troops in the city. For context, there are basically 4 roads for the Ukrainians in and out of Bakhmut. The T0513 road, which runs north to Seversk, the M03, which runs northwest to Sloviansk, the T0504, which runs southwest to Kostiantynivka, and then on to Kramatorsk, and the O0506, a smaller road which runs west through Chasiv Yar. By early March, 3 of these 4 routes had been cut off, leaving the Ukrainians exclusively reliant on the O0506 and the dirt roads nearby. At this point, a lot of people were telling the Ukrainians to retreat. The US has apparently been telling Kyiv to retreat since January, and by early March, even the most hawkish supporters of Ukraine were getting a bit worried. The Kyiv Independent, for example, ran a piece in early March claiming that Ukrainian soldiers weren't being protected, and their defense correspondent tweeted that he hoped the Ukrainian command really knows what it's doing in Bakhmut. Zelensky nonetheless refused to retreat, insisting that his generals unanimously advised him to stay in the town for 2 reasons. First, Zelensky argued that Bakhmut's collapse would gift the Russians an open road to other crucial settlements in Donbass, including Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Second, Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials have claimed that Bakhmut is a good place to retreat Russian forces, and that the Russians are losing far more troops in Bakhmut than the Ukrainians. So, holding Bakhmut is an effective way of bleeding out Russian forces. At the time, most analysts were skeptical, and many pro-Ukrainian commentators were anxious that the thousands of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut could end up being encircled by Wagner, which would be a strategic and symbolic disaster for Kyiv. However, in the last couple of weeks, the Russian advance has apparently stalled. Russian forces have made no significant progress, and a week ago, the Ukrainians successfully pushed Wagner back from Ivanivska, opening up the T0504 highway. Ukrainian telegram channels claimed that Ukrainian forces had established total control over Ivanivska, and that the Russian attack had apparently exhausted itself. Similarly, on Saturday, General Zaluzhny told the Wall Street Journal that the front lines around Bakhmut had stabilised, and that the UK Ministry of Defence claimed that the Russian assault on Bakhmut had largely stalled. So what's happened here? Why has the advance stalled? Well, it could just be bog-standard Russian incompetence. The Russian army has reliably underperformed throughout the war, and this could be just another data point on that trend line. However, it's also possible that it's something to do with the ongoing row between the Wagner Group and the Russian Ministry of Defence, who really don't get on. For starters, Wagner has publicly criticised the Russian MOD for not sending Wagner enough ammunition, and Wagner's founder, Evgeny Prigozhin, has in the past mocked the Russian army for its apparent ineffectiveness. Prigozhin has also been engaged in a long-running spat with Russia's defence minister, Sergei Shoigu, who he's accused of treason. Shoigu has even set up his own paramilitary force called the Patriot PMC, which is clearly intended as a competitor to Wagner. Anyway, for the last few months, the Russian MOD has tried to undermine Wagner, both by limiting its ammunition and banning Wagner from recruiting from prison colonies, which is where it found most of its troops. In response, Prigozhin has become increasingly vocal in his criticism of the Russian MOD. Prigozhin told Shoigu to send his son-in-law to Wagner, and just a couple of weeks ago, Prigozhin warned the Kremlin that after the capture of Bakhmut, he would turn Wagner from a private company into an army with an ideology, which basically implies it would become independent from the wider Russian army. Now, this won't have gone down well in the Kremlin, especially Shoigu, and it's very possible that they're further limiting their support for Wagner to deny Prigozhin any credit and keep him quiet. This might explain why Wagner has recently announced that they're redirecting some of their resources towards Africa. Prigozhin might just be fed up with all this. It's also worth saying that Shoigu's Patriot PMC are currently making progress around the Ukrainian-held suburb of Avdiivka. And it could be that Shoigu wants to claim his own victory in Avdiivka first, to minimise the impact of Wagner's potential capture of Bakhmut. If this is the plan, it's not a good one. Avdiivka has been a Ukrainian stronghold since 2014, and taking it will take a very long time. All in all, this is great news for Ukraine. The continued defence of Bakhmut is already becoming a symbolic victory for the Ukrainians, and the apparent tension between Prigozhin and Shoigu are seriously undermining Russia's military capacity. If that's not enough TLDR for one day, then you ought to check out our series This Week in Parliament, which has just made a magnificent return. That's not a quote or something, it's just a thing I'm saying. This Week in Parliament is the show where we run down exactly what happened in Parliament in the preceding week, breaking down the debates, laws and bills which otherwise you'd totally miss, and explaining what really happens in Britain's seat of power when you brush aside all the shouting and arm-waving. New episodes come out every week, only on Nebula. But that's not all. There's also the extended version of the daily briefing every single weekday, a bunch of exclusive explainer videos, some silly fun content, and all of our videos totally ad-free. It's not just TLDR either. We're joined by a bunch of your favourite creators, from Wendover and Real Life Law to Johnny Harris. Which means there's a whole load of exclusive videos, early access to loads of creators, and all the ad-free viewing you can handle. Signing up using our link in the description gets you access for just $2.50 a month, and is the absolute best way to support the channel. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you on Nebula.